The moon had no real name when the war started. Someone at Central Command had stamped it Yeren 4 on a star chart 11 years ago, and the name stuck the way bad names always do. Not because anyone liked it, but because too many people had died there to call it anything else now. It was not a beautiful moon. It had never been beautiful. The ground was the color of old rust, cracked in long lines like the skin of something that had dried out a long time ago. The sky was a brownish yellow that made everything look slightly sick. There were no trees. There had been something like grass once, a low gray scrub that covered the plains, but 11 years of weapons fire and troop movements and chemical runoff had burned most of it away. What was left was mostly ash and rock, and the kind of silence that comes after a very loud thing has finally stopped. Both sides had been fighting over Yeren 4 for 3 years. Not because it was worth anything. The moon had no resources worth taking, no strategic position worth holding, no population worth protecting. It was worth nothing. But it sat on the border between human-controlled space and the territory held by the Galactic Compact, and both sides had decided at some point that giving it up would mean something. So they kept sending soldiers there to die on rust-colored ground under a sick yellow sky, and neither side moved very far in any direction, and the moon stayed worthless. On the morning the ceasefire flag went up, a soldier named Private Dara Ohen was lying in a shell crater about 200 meters from the human forward line. She had been there for 6 hours. Her right leg was broken in 2 places, and her radio was dead, and she had used her last field bandage 3 hours ago. She was 19 years old. She had grown up in a city on the coast of what used to be Nigeria, and she had joined the military because her brother was already in it, and she had always followed her brother into things. She had spent most of the 6 hours looking at the sky. There was not much else to do. When the pain got bad, she pressed her face into the dirt and breathed through it. When it eased a little, she looked at the sky again, the yellow-brown of it, the way the light moved through it, thin and weak, nothing like sunlight back home. She was not afraid of dying. Oh, she had already decided that part. What she was afraid of was being left there, lying in the crater until she simply stopped. Nobody finding her. Nobody knowing which crater. She heard the ceasefire signal at around midday, a long tone broadcast on all military frequencies, the kind of sound that made your chest loosen, whether you wanted it to or not. She heard movement at the forward line, voices. Then she heard something she had not expected to hear. Someone calling her name. They found her 20 minutes later, 2 medics in white-marked suits moving fast across the open ground between the lines. One of them was her brother. He did not say anything when he dropped into the crater beside her. He just put his hand on her face for a second, checking her eyes. Then he got to work. That was the last thing Private Dara Owen remembered clearly from that morning. The ceasefire had been arranged 3 days earlier through the neutral relay station at the edge of the Yeren system. Both sides had agreed to a 6-hour window for the removal of wounded personnel and the recovery of the dead. This was standard procedure. Both sides had done it before, on Yeren 4, and on a dozen other contested moons and stations. The rules were clear, and both sides had signed them years ago. Wounded combatants were not combatants. Medical personnel were not combatants. The flag meant the shooting stopped. This was not complicated. The Vreth did not find it complicated either. They found it incorrect. A sub-executor Vral stood at the observation post on the high ridge that overlooked the plains and watched the humans move through the field below. He was tall, even for a Vreth, with the long gray-plated limbs and flat, wide head that his species had evolved for cold environments. He wore a command robe over his armor, dark blue, the kind that indicated a rank that expected to be obeyed without repetition. He had held his position for 9 years. He had fought humans for most of them. He watched the white-marked figures moving between the craters and the rubble. He counted them, 41, most of them medics. A few were carrying the wounded on stretchers. Some were marking the dead with flags for later recovery. Vral was not a cruel being. He did not enjoy suffering. Amok, he had never thought of himself as someone who caused unnecessary harm. He considered himself practical. He considered himself logical. He looked at the field below him, and he thought through the logic carefully, the way he always did, the way his training had taught him to approach every tactical question. A wounded human would heal. That was the nature of humans. They healed from things that would finish other species. A healed human would return to combat. A human who returned to combat would kill more Vreth soldiers. 41 wounded humans, recovered, healed, returned to the front line, represented a future force of 41 trained fighters. That was a measurable threat, a preventable one. He did not hate them. He simply calculated them. He gave the order to his weapons officer without raising his voice, and the first shots hit the medics. Solen observer Lorene Sai was positioned in the compact's neutral monitoring station, a sealed structure on the eastern edge of the plane that both sides had agreed to respect as an observation post. Her job was to watch the ceasefire and file a report. She had done this kind of work for 6 years. She was calm and careful, and she wrote very clean reports. She was watching through her recording equipment when the first shots came. She thought at first it was a misfire, an accident, a malfunction in some soldier's weapon on either side. She kept watching. It was not an accident. She watched the medics fall. She watched the wounded on the stretchers fall. She watched the people crawling toward the fallen fall in turn. She watched all of it through her recording equipment, and she wrote nothing in her report for the first several minutes because her hands were not working correctly. She was pressing them flat against the console to keep them still. She had seen death before. She had filed reports after battles that had killed 10,000 in a single day. She was not naive about war. She understood what war was. But there was a ceasefire flag in the air. She could see it from where she sat. It was still flying. It had been flying the whole time. She filed her report 40 minutes later, after the field was quiet and the Vreth weapons had gone silent. The report was precise. It listed what she had seen, in the order she had seen it, with timestamps and visual documentation attached. She was professional about it. She was Solen. They were always professional. At the end of the report, she added one note. She had not planned to add it. It came out of her without planning, the way things do when something has changed inside you and you have not yet figured out what. She wrote, "The humans on the ridge who watched the field, approximately 16 soldiers, did not call out or attempt to charge the Vreth position. They did not fire back. They made no sound that my equipment could detect. They simply became very still. I have studied human behavior patterns for many years, and I could not identify what I was seeing in them from this distance. I am not able to name what I observed. I want the record to reflect that I observed it." She sent the report. She sat in the monitoring station for a long time after. Outside, the ceasefire flag was still flying over the field. The Vreth had not taken it down. In Vral's reasoning, there had been nothing to interrupt the ceasefire. He had not fired on active combatants. He had simply resolved a future threat. The flag was still valid. The rules, as he understood them, were still intact. He filed his own report. He called it a field-efficient neutralization of future combatants. He used clean language. He was, in his way, also professional. Colonel Sarah Vance had been in the forward command shelter when the ceasefire shots started. She heard them before she understood what they were. By the time she got to the ridge, it was over. She stood at the edge of the ridge and looked at the field. She was 44 years old, and she had been fighting this war for 9 of those years, and she had seen things that she did not think about if she could help it. She looked at the field below, and she cataloged what she was seeing. She had trained herself to do that, to see it clearly and file it away clearly before the rest of her caught up. 41 people, most of them marked in white, the stretchers overturned, the white-marked suits dark with the rust-colored dirt and darker things. Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Chen, was standing beside her. He was 26, and he had been in this war for 2 years, and he had not yet learned to look at things the way she looked at them. He was not looking at the field. He was looking at her. She said nothing for a while. The soldiers on the ridge were quiet, all of them. Not the kind of quiet that happens when people are shocked. A different kind. The kind that comes after the shock has already moved through you, and what's left is something with no name in any language she knew, something old and deep, something that did not make noise. She turned and walked back to the command shelter. She sat down at the communications console. She opened a channel to Compact High Command, not to Vreth Command, to the Compact as a whole, the combined authority of the 4 species that ran it. She wanted to make sure the right people heard what she was about to say. She was quiet for a moment before she spoke. She was choosing the right words, not the most words, the right ones. She said, "You should not have done that." She closed the channel. Lieutenant Shen had followed her in. He stood in the doorway. He said, carefully, "Colonel, what do we do now?" She was already pulling up a different frequency. Command back on Earth. The actual command, not field command, not sector command. The people who made decisions that could not be unmade. "We report it," she said. "We report everything exactly as it happened. We send the footage. We send Lorene Sa's report. We send all of it. And then?" She looked at the communication screen. She thought about the field, the 41 names she would learn before the day was out. She already knew 2 of them. A medic named Yusuf, who had treated her once for a cracked rib and had made her laugh during the process, which had hurt, and she had been glad of the pain because the laughing was worth it. And a girl named Dara, whose brother had been found beside her in the crater, both of them dead. 2, and then we wait, she said, and we see what kind of people we are. The Vreth High Command received her transmission. They filed it. An automated system flagged it for review, and a junior intelligence officer reviewed it and wrote a 2-line summary. Human Field Commander issued verbal response to ceasefire incident at Yeren 4. No tactical threat identified. Recommend monitoring. The monitoring officer who received that summary read it, made a note, moved on to other things. In the compact diplomatic chambers, the transmission was received by a different set of eyes. Ambassador Dawhari 7 read it 4 times. He was the oldest compact expert on human behavior that existed. He had spent 30 years studying them. He had read their history, their wars, their literature, their law. And he had sat across from human diplomats and soldiers and teachers and politicians. He thought he understood them as well as any non-human could. He read the 6 words 6 times. "You should not have done that." He did not sleep that night. He sat at his desk and he read the words again, and he thought about what he knew about humans, which was considerable, and he thought about what those words meant in the context of everything he knew. There was a human document he had studied years ago. It was very old, written in a century when humans were still killing each other with metal and fire on a single planet. It listed things that were not allowed in war, protected categories, the wounded, the marked, the healers, the surrendered. He pulled the document up on his screen and read through it. He had read it before. He had always thought of it as a historical artifact, an interesting piece of evidence about early human civilization, something they had evolved past, or at least grown to handle with more sophistication. He read it again now, and he felt something he could not name. He began composing a message to Compact High Command. He chose his words carefully. He was, like Lorene Sa, a professional. He tried to put into the message exactly what he believed, without exaggeration, without alarm, without the feeling in his chest that was making his hands do the same thing Lorene Sa's hands had done in the monitoring station. He wrote, "I want to draw the attention of High Command to the Yeren 4 incident, and specifically to the human response to it. I have studied humans for 30 years. I have seen them respond to losses before. I have seen them grieve, and I have seen them retaliate, and I have seen them negotiate from grief, and I have seen them use grief as a tactical position. What I observed in Colonel Vance's transmission is not any of those things. I am not certain I have a category for it. I am asking High Command to take this incident seriously, not as a military incident, but as something else. I am not yet able to say exactly what." He sent the message. He sat back. On the field at Yeren 4, someone had finally taken the ceasefire flag down. It had flown for 4 hours after the last shot, long enough that the light had changed, the sick yellow of the sky going darker, the plane going from rust to something closer to brown in the shadow of evening. 41 names, written in the field reports of both sides in different languages and under different headings. On the Vreth side, future threat, neutralized. On the human side, the names, just the names in a column, nothing beside them, no notation needed, no status. The column was titled simply, "Ours." The field was quiet. The flag was down. The stars were coming out above Yeren 4, which had no real name and had never been beautiful, and had now become the thing that all worthless places eventually become when enough people die on them. A sight, a line drawn, a word that had not yet been spoken but was already in the air, already forming in 100 different mouths across 6 star systems, moving toward the moment when someone would say it out loud. Reckoning, it was a human word. Most species didn't have an exact translation, not because the concept was foreign to them, because they had never needed to weight it quite that heavily, never needed to make it mean quite what humans meant when they said it. The night settled over Yeren 4. Nobody slept much on either side of the line. In the human command shelter, Sarah Vance sat with the list of 41 names and read them until she had memorized everyone. It took most of the night. She had a good memory. She had always had a good memory. She considered it her job now to have a perfect one. She said nothing while she read, just the names, quiet to herself in the dark. When she finished, she started again from the top. The footage reached Earth in 11 hours. It traveled through the relay network that humans had built across the outer systems over 4 decades of space travel. A chain of signal boosters stretching from the inner colonies all the way back to the homeworld, like a long wire connecting everything they had built out there to the place they had started. 11 hours was fast. It was as fast as physics allowed. By the time it arrived, the Military Intelligence Office had already received Colonel Vance's initial report and the footage from the Compact's own observer, Lorene Saw, which the Compact had shared through the neutral relay station as part of standard ceasefire documentation. Lorene Saw's footage was actually cleaner than the human side's. Better angle, better resolution. She had been positioned well. The intelligence office processed the footage. Johnny, a senior analyst, watched it once, stopped it, sat for a minute, and then walked directly to the office of General Haruto Mace, who was the head of the UN Military Command, and said simply, "You need to see this now." General Mace watched it. He was 61 years old. He had white hair cut close and a face that had learned a long time ago not to show things while other people were in the room. He watched the footage from start to finish without speaking. When it ended, he said, "Play it again." The analyst played it again. When it ended the second time, he said, "Get me the Secretary General." The Secretary General watched it 30 minutes later. By the following morning, 22 heads of state and colonial governors had seen it. By the following evening, why, it had been seen by everyone who needed to see it and several people who had not needed to, but had gotten hold of it anyway, because information travels the same way light does. It does not check with you before it goes somewhere. The UN War Council was called into emergency session. Ambassador Dahari 7 had a pass to observe the War Council sessions. He had held it for 6 years. He had used it many times. He was, as he had told his staff, a scholar, and scholars observe things. He arrived early and sat in the observer's gallery above the main chamber floor. The chamber was filling below him. He watched the human delegates come in, from the Earth nations, from the outer colonies, from the off-world stations where the signal lag meant some of them were watching through screens with a delay of several seconds between what was said and what they heard. He noted the way they moved. He studied people's bodies the way a good observer should, not just their words. The human delegates moved differently than usual. He had attended many of these sessions. Usually there was a certain amount of what he had learned to identify as political theater. The way people sat, the conversations they had with each other before the session started, the performance of position. Today there was none of it. They came in and they sat down. They did not talk much to each other. They looked at the chamber floor in front of them. Like soldiers, Dahari 7 thought. They moved like soldiers, even the ones who had never been soldiers. Something had shifted in the way they were carrying themselves. He took careful notes. The session opened. The Secretary General, a woman named Adiz Obi, stood at the head of the chamber. She was a small person with a large presence. The kind of person who made the room she was in feel like her room. She had grown up in Lagos and had spent 30 years in politics before this job, and she had the look of someone who had been disappointed by humans many times and had made her peace with it without ever quite forgiving them. She did not give a speech. She said, "You have all seen the footage. There is nothing for me to add to what you have already seen. The question before this council is how we respond. I will take the floor. She stepped back. The floor was open. The first delegate to speak was from the Martian colonies. His name was Tariq Osei, and he was known for long, careful speeches that examined every side of an issue before arriving at any conclusion. He stood up and said 4 words. This is not acceptable. Then he sat down. The delegate from the European Federation stood. She said, I second that position. She sat down. This was unusual. This was not how the War Council worked. The War Council worked through argument and counter-argument and amendments and the slow grinding process of building agreement between people who did not naturally agree. Dowhari 7 had watched it work this way for 6 years. He had always found it interesting. Today it was doing something else. He wrote in his notes, they are not debating, they are confirming something they have already decided. When this is a different kind of session. Delegate after delegate stood. Some said more than others. The representative from the belt stations gave a short speech about the Geneva Convention. Dowhari 7 looked up the reference quickly on his records and quoted several of its articles with precision. The delegate from the Kepler colony spoke for about 2 minutes about a concept she called the protected class, explaining it clearly for the record, even though everyone in the room clearly already understood it. The delegate from the Pacific Coalition said nothing, just stood when it was his turn, and nodded and sat back down. That nod was counted as a vote. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Dowhari 7 sat in the observer's gallery and looked at his notes. Unanimous. He checked the records on his screen. When the last unanimous vote in the UN War Council had been 31 years ago, on a question about evacuating civilians from a collapsing colony station. Before that, you had to go back further. Unanimous votes were not how humans worked. They argued. They always argued. He had always thought of human arguing as one of their most defining characteristics. The way they could find disagreement in anything, the way no two of them ever seemed to want exactly the same thing. They wanted the same thing today. He left the gallery quickly after the vote. He had a message to send. The vote was not a declaration of war. The war was already happening. It had been happening for 11 years. The vote was for something else, something that did not have a simple name in most languages, including human ones. The official designation in the War Council records was Protocol Nemesis, which was Latin, an old Earth language that humans used mainly for naming things they wanted to sound important or permanent. Dowhari 7 knew what Nemesis meant. He had studied enough human history and mythology to know exactly what they had named this. He found a corner of a corridor outside the chamber and wrote his message to Compact High Command. He wrote quickly, which was unusual for him. He was usually careful with his words. But there was a feeling in his chest that was working against his usual care. He wrote, the War Council vote has passed, unanimous, first unanimous vote in 31 years. They have authorized what they are calling Protocol Nemesis. I want to be very clear about what this means. This is not an escalation. An escalation is a larger version of what was already happening. This is a different category of thing. Over the past 30 years, I have studied humans in great detail. I have studied their wars, the wars they fought against each other before they had space travel, and the wars they have fought since. I have noticed something in that history that I want to share now. Humans have a particular relationship with one specific category of act: the killing of the protected, the wounded, the healer, the surrendered. Other species have this too, to some degree, but humans built documents around it. They wrote it down in law. They died to defend it. When that line is crossed, something happens in them that is not like their other responses to being attacked or damaged or killed. I am not able to find a clean scientific word for it. The closest human word I can find is, they become purposeful, not angry, not afraid, not strategic, purposeful, in the way that a river becomes purposeful when you remove the dam. I am advising High Command to take the following actions immediately. He listed the actions. They were reasonable, diplomatic, the kind of actions a 30-year expert in human relations would recommend in a crisis. He sent the message. He stood in the corridor. He thought about the chamber, the way the delegates had moved, the unanimous vote. He thought about rivers. In the weeks that followed the vote, the signals started changing. The Compact's intelligence services tracked military transmissions the way all intelligence services do. Not always the content, but the pattern, the frequency, the codes, the way a fleet moves before it moves. And they had been tracking human military signals for 11 years, and they had learned to read the patterns well enough to build predictions that were, on average, about 70% accurate. The predictions stopped working. The signals changed. Not the content. The content was still encoded and took time to crack. The codes themselves changed. The classification systems changed. Ships that had been broadcasting standard fleet movement codes for years shifted to a code set that the Compact's analysts had never seen before. The analysts worked on it. They made progress. They cracked enough of it within 2 weeks to read the classification at the top of each broadcast. The classification was a single word. They translated it carefully, checking 3 different human language databases to make sure they had it right. The word was punitive. The lead analyst brought this to Compact Military High Command in person, which was unusual. She was a careful, quiet woman who usually sent reports through the standard channels. She came in person because she felt the report was the kind of report that should be delivered by a person and not a screen. She explained the new codes. She explained the new classification. She put the translation on the table. She said, "I want to make sure the command understands what this word means in context. Punitive does not mean strategic. It does not mean the goal is territory or resource or tactical advantage. Punitive means the action is its own goal. Punitive means the purpose is the action itself." The commanding admiral of Compact Military High Command, a Vreth named Foros, looked at the word on the table. He said, "Ari, they are doing this for show. It is psychological." The analyst said carefully, "I don't believe that's correct, Admiral." Foros said, "Then what do you believe it is?" She thought about the question for a moment. She had a good answer. She had been building it in her head for the last several days as she worked through the signals, as she watched the pattern of fleet movements, as she read everything she could find about the Geneva Convention and the War Council vote and the history of what humans did when they used this particular classification. She said, "I believe they are not trying to win the war anymore." Foros looked at her. "They have changed the question," she said. "The war was about territory, about containing human expansion. That was the question we were all answering. They have put that question down. They are answering a different question now." "What question?" She looked at the word on the table. "What happens to the people who gave the order at Yeren 4, she said. "That's the question they're answering. Only that question, until it's answered." The room was quiet. She added, "I want to note for the record that this is not something we modeled for. In 11 years of conflict analysis, we did not build a model for this scenario. I do not have a prediction for it. I want High Command to understand that I cannot tell you what happens next because we do not have the data set for it. We have never encountered this before." Ambassador Dowhari 7 received High Command's response to his message 4 days after he sent it. The response was short. It told him that his analysis had become compromised by proximity, put it that he had spent too long among humans and was no longer able to assess them objectively. That humans were a capable but fundamentally limited species with strong endurance metrics and a history of emotional decision-making that rarely produced long-term strategic advantage. That the Compact had been managing human expansion for 11 years and understood the parameters well. That he should report to the nearest transit point for reassignment. He read the message twice. He thought about the War Council chamber, the way the delegates had moved, the way the vote had gone. He thought about rivers. He thought about the word purposeful. He thought about a passage from a human history text he had read many years ago, from a period of their history when they were still fighting their wars on a single planet. The text described a particular phase of a particular war. He could not remember all of it. He remembered one line. He had thought it was poetic when he first read it, metaphorical, the kind of language people used when they wanted to make history sound dramatic. He thought about it now and he did not think it was metaphor anymore. The line had said, "There is a kind of anger that does not burn hot. It burns cold. Cold things last longer than hot ones. Cold is patient. The most dangerous soldiers in any war are not the ones who are angry. They are the ones who have gone past anger into something quiet." He sent a response to High Command. He said he would be on the next transport. He began packing. He had lived in this apartment for 6 years. He had books everywhere. Physical books, which he preferred to screens. Because you could not highlight a screen the way you could a page. He started putting them in cases. He worked slowly, because there were many of them. He stopped at one of the human history books. He stood for a moment, holding it. Then he put it in the case with the others. He took the transit home to Dalhara Prime, and he did not explain to anyone who asked why he had requested the reassignment, and he did not give interviews to the media organizations that reached out to him after the war entered its new phase. He sat in his home, and he watched what happened next from a distance, and he was not surprised by any of it, and he found that not being surprised was the loneliest feeling he had ever had. The last thing that changed in those early weeks was something small, simple, the kind of thing that could be missed if you were not paying close attention. The human fleet in the Yaren system, the ships that had been holding the borderline for 11 years, trading territory back and forth with compact forces in the slow grinding way of that war, began moving, not toward compact territory, not in a formation built for taking and holding ground. They moved in small groups, fast, traveling in patterns that the compact's tracking systems could not predict because the patterns were not built for prediction. They were built for something else. A compact signals officer, watching the movement patterns from a station on the edge of the Yaren system, tried to map what the humans were doing. She worked at it for several days. She overlaid the fleet movements against the star charts, looking for the strategic logic. She could not find it. Then she tried overlaying the movements against something else, against the Vreth military command structure, against the chain of command that had been in operation at Yaren 4 on the day of the massacre, against the list of ships and stations and commanders that had been part of the operation. She found the pattern immediately. She sat with it for a long time. She ran the overlay 3 more times to make sure. Then she filed her report. She wrote it in careful professional language. She described what she had found. She noted the implications. She recommended that the compact military high command review the data immediately. At the bottom of the report, in the section for additional observations, she wrote one sentence that was not professional language. She wrote it anyway because she could not leave it out. She wrote, "They know exactly who gave the order. They know exactly who passed it down. They know exactly who was there. I do not know how they know this, but they know it, and they are going to all of those people one at a time, and I am not able to find anything in our response capabilities that would stop them from doing this." She sent the report. Outside the station's windows, the stars were very still and very cold, the way they always were, the way they had always been. Nothing about the sky had changed, but something in it was moving now, purposeful as a river with the dam removed, quiet as cold, patient as things that have already decided. The humans were making a list, and they had started at the top. The first prisoners came back 2 weeks after the vote. There were 30 of them. Vreth soldiers captured during a skirmish near the Yaren system's second planet, taken in a fight that both sides had been having versions of for years. Small engagements along the border, the kind that killed dozens rather than thousands. Under normal war conditions, they would have been held, documented, traded eventually as part of a prisoner exchange. The compact prepared for that process. They began the documentation on their end. They identified the soldiers, recorded their units and ranks, opened the standard prisoner file that the system required. The soldiers were returned before the file was finished. 30 Vreth soldiers arrived back at the compact border station in a transport marked with medical symbols. They were in good condition, better than expected, given the fight they had been taken in. Because someone had treated their wounds. Someone had fed them. All 30 arrived with the same item, a small data chip, sealed, issued to each of them individually. The transport included a short message, no signature, no official heading, just text. "These soldiers are returned without condition. The chips are for them, not for you. Please ensure they receive them." The border station commander, a Selen officer named Dorith Vin, reviewed the returned prisoners, checked their condition, confirmed they were who the human records said they were. He noted that none of them appeared to have been harmed beyond their battle injuries. He noted the chips. He flagged them for analysis before distribution. His analysis team cracked the chip encryption in under an hour, which was easy because the chips were not encrypted to keep people out. They were just sealed against moisture and radiation. Inside each one was a single file, a single piece of footage. Yaren 4. Dorothy Vin watched the footage. He had heard about it. He had read the reports. Hearing about something and watching the footage of it were different experiences, and he sat with that difference for a while after the footage ended. He thought about the instruction in the human message. The chips are for them, not for you. He ordered the chips distributed to the 30 soldiers as the humans had requested. He filed a report on the incident. In the observation section, he wrote, "I have no strategic analysis to offer. I am not sure this is a strategic action. I am not sure what kind of action it is." Arch Admiral Serene Voss of the Selene Navy received Dorothy Vin's report among 40 others that week, and she almost missed it. She had the kind of job where important things hid inside piles of other things, and she had learned to read quickly and sort quickly and identify what needed her full attention versus what needed a reply and what needed to be filed. She was reading through the pile on a Wednesday when she hit Dorothy Vin's report and stopped. She read it twice. She read it a third time. Then she went back to her records and pulled every human action report she had for the 3 weeks since the War Council vote. All of them. She had a large screen on one wall of her office, and she put everything on it. Fleet movements, engagement reports, signal logs, the prisoner returns. Every piece of data her intelligence division had collected on what humans were doing since Yaren 4. She stood at her screen for most of a day. As Serene Voss was, by her own assessment and most other people's assessment, the best strategic military mind the Selene had produced in 2 generations. She had won battles that others said could not be won. She understood war the way that some people understood mathematics. Not just the rules of it, but the feel of it, the shape of it, the way a situation had a correct answer that you could recognize if you had the right kind of mind. She was rarely surprised. Being rarely surprised was the feature of her mind she was most proud of. She was surprised now. The humans were not taking territory. In 11 years of war, the fight had always been about territory. The map had moved back and forth by degrees. It was the fundamental logic of the conflict. You take, they take back. You both take elsewhere, the line moves. It was a comprehensible kind of war. She had built her entire strategic model on it. They had put the map down. She could see it in the movements. The fleets were not positioning for territorial control. They were not building supply lines. They were not establishing footholds. They were moving like something that did not care about land at all. Moving like a purpose rather than an army. She found the pattern the way Dorothy Vin's analyst had found it, by accident and then suddenly all at once. She overlaid the movements against the Vreth command structure and the list of ships and commanders that had been part of Yaren 4. She stared at the result. They were hunting, specifically, carefully, methodically hunting the people responsible for giving the order and carrying it out at Yaren 4. Not the Vreth species. Not the Vreth military as a whole. The specific chain of command. The specific individuals. The humans had apparently obtained, she did not know how, and this bothered her, a full accounting of who had been involved. They had a list. They were working through it. She had been in military command for 22 years. She had studied 60 different civilizations' approaches to warfare as part of her strategic education. She had a library of case studies for how different species responded to different provocations. She was very well educated on the subject. She did not have a case study for this. She sat at her desk and she wrote her analysis. She was honest in it, which was her habit even when honesty was uncomfortable. She wrote, "Humans appear to have 2 concepts that both translate to our word for justice. One is the version we are familiar with, balance, proportion, the restoration of a state that was disrupted. The other is something else. The nearest translation I can find in our language is approximately the settling of an account that cannot be left unsettled. They have a word for it in one of their oldest languages, reckoning. I believe we should have learned this word before we got to this point." She sent the analysis to the Selene High Council and requested an urgent meeting. The compact was not a unified government, it was an alliance. There was a difference. A government could make decisions and have them happen. An alliance made decisions and then watched its members decide whether to actually do them, which was a slower and more frustrating process. The Keth were the first to move. The Keth were a species from a cold, rocky system in the middle of the Compact's territory. They were not the largest or the most powerful of the four Compact species. They were thoughtful and methodical, and they had a long memory, which was the trait that mattered most right now. 800 years ago, they had nearly ended themselves in a civil war that had started, in the way civil wars do, with a list of grievances that kept growing. The war had reached a point where no one was taking prisoners, and no one was treating wounds, and no one was allowing the dead to be claimed. There had been a word for what happened to a society that stopped doing those things. The Keth still taught that word in their schools. The Keth ambassador to the Compact, Orin Sal, which requested a formal session with the Compact Military Committee 1 week after Serene Voss sent her analysis. She arrived with a short statement. She read it without preamble. She said, "The Keth Republic formally dissociates from the Compact military position on the Yeren 4 incident. We do not support the actions taken. We have never supported them. We wish to make clear for the record that we were not informed before the action was taken, and we were not consulted. We wish to be equally clear about what we believe the action was. It was a violation of protected class. We have a word for this in Keth. It predates our space age. It means the removal of a being from war. When a being is removed from war, by wound or by surrender or by the act of healing, they are no longer part of the war. Killing them is not a military act. It is something else. We do not participate in something else. We are requesting immediate bilateral ceasefire negotiations with the human forces, and we are withdrawing our ships from the Yeren border." The meeting was not pleasant after that. Vreth Admiral Forrest argued that the Keth were surrendering to pressure, that this was exactly what the humans wanted, that a fracture in the Compact was the strategic goal of the whole operation. Orin Sal said calmly, "I am not doing this because of human strategy. I am doing this because of what happened on that field." She left. The Dahari followed the Keth within 6 days. Their reasons were different. The Dahari were more pragmatic, more focused on long-term positioning, but the result was the same. They contacted human command. They requested talks. They sent their ships home. Naonha, the Vreth flagship, Vreth Ascendant, was one of the largest ships in the Compact fleet. 14 kilometers from bow to stern. It had been in service for 30 years and had fought in 4 major engagements and had never been beaten. It was the ship sub-executor Vral had used to command the Yeren 4 operation. It was his ship. He had served on it for most of his military career. A Compact patrol found it drifting in the Keth corridor on a Tuesday morning. The patrol ship's captain approached carefully. No distress signal had been sent. There was no weapons fire visible. The ship was intact, all 14 kilometers of it. Every hull plate in place, every weapons system powered down, no sign of breach or impact or explosion. It was simply drifting, like something that had forgotten it was supposed to be going somewhere. Hara, the captain, requested boarding permission by the standard procedure. He received no response. He boarded. The ship was fully crewed. Every member of the complement was at their station or in their quarters. All of them were dead. No marks of violence that the initial sweep could find. No signs of hull breach. No environmental failure that would explain it. Just the entire crew of one of the largest warships in the Compact fleet. Dead, undisturbed, like they had simply stopped. Vral was found in his command chair on the bridge. He looked to the boarding captain's eye almost peaceful, which was the part that the captain found hardest to include in his report, because peaceful was not the word a report should contain, and he was a professional, and he tried to write professionally. But he included it because he was also honest, and the record should say what it was. The exterior of the ship had been painted. The captain had not noticed it on approach because the color matched the ship's hull in the distance. But up close it was visible. A full hull marking in a paint that his scanner told him was formulated to survive hard vacuum and radiation for approximately 3,000 years. Every major language of the Compact was represented, and 17 human languages, and the message was the same in all of them, translated but consistent. He read it. He read it twice. He included it in his report verbatim. This is what happens when you kill the wounded. The report went up the chain immediately. It reached Compact High Command within hours. It reached the Solin High Council, the remaining Vreth Command, one in several independent news organizations that had embedded themselves near the border systems almost simultaneously. The news organizations published it. The galaxy read it. Serene Voss was eating breakfast when the report came in. She stopped eating. She read the report carefully. She set her fork down and did not pick it up again. She thought about the Vreth Ascendant. She thought about 14 kilometers of warship, fully crewed, found drifting with no sign of a fight. She thought about what it meant tactically to be able to do that, to find a ship that size, board it or breach it or whatever had happened and leave no marks, no evidence, no engagement visible in the sensor logs. Humans had been in this war for 11 years. She had always assessed them honestly, which meant she had assessed them as formidable. She was strong endurance, good adaptability, emotionally resilient, better than expected at working under sustained pressure. She had thought she understood what they were capable of. She thought about the ship again. 3,000 years. That was how long the paint was made to last. They had not painted it for today. They had painted it for everyone who came after. They had painted it for the ships and explorers and civilizations that would pass through the Keth corridor in a century, in 5 centuries, in 2,000 years. They were not leaving a message for the compact. They were leaving it for the future. She picked up her communicator and contacted her aide. She said, "Get me a direct channel to the human command. Whoever is in charge of this operation, I want to talk to them." Her aide said, "Admiral, that's outside protocol. We'd need authorization from—" "I'm authorizing it," she said. "Get me the channel." She did not get the channel that day. It took 3 more days of navigation through the communication protocols, the careful and frustrating process of establishing contact between 2 sides that were technically still at war, while 2 of the 4 compact species were now not technically at war with those same humans, and the lines were getting complicated. While she waited, she kept working through her analysis. She kept pulling reports. She kept adding to the picture she was building. A pattern she had noticed in the first week was clearer now. The humans were sending prisoners back. Every compact soldier captured since the vote had been processed, treated if wounded, and returned. Without condition. With a chip. Every time. She had initially thought this was a message, a demonstration, a way of saying, "We will fight you, but we will not be like you." She thought about it more carefully now. She thought about it the way she thought about military actions. Not as communication, but as design. What did this accomplish? What did it do to the person who received it? 30 Vreth soldiers returned, each with footage of Yaren 4. Not court-pressured to watch it, not required to. Just given it, handed it. "Here, this is what your side did. We want you to have seen it." She thought about the 30 soldiers. She thought about them going home and living with that chip in their possession, with the footage on it, with the knowledge that the humans had held them and could have done anything and instead had fed them and treated them and sent them back. She thought about what that did to a soldier's understanding of the war they were fighting. It was, she realized, the most sophisticated thing she had seen either side do in 11 years. It was not violence. It was not threat. It was just a question handed to 30 people, and the question was, "Do you know what you are part of?" She added a new section to her analysis. She titled it, "Observations on Human Strategic Patience." She wrote, "I have been trying to understand what humans are doing and why it is working in ways that our standard models cannot account for. I believe the answer is that humans are not operating within a strategic frame at all. They are operating within a moral frame. This is not the same thing. Moral frames are not interested in efficiency. Moral frames are interested in being correct. An enemy operating within a moral frame does not ask what the most efficient action is. They ask what the right action is. This is harder to predict, harder to counter, and harder to exhaust. You can exhaust efficiency. You cannot exhaust a species that believes, genuinely believes, as a group, not as propaganda, but as actual conviction, that they are doing what must be done." She paused. She read what she had written. She added one more line. "I have studied war for my entire adult life, and I will tell you honestly that I have never wanted to be on the wrong side of this particular type of enemy. The Vreth put us on the wrong side at Yaren 4. I am going to fix that." She sent the analysis to the council. She went back to waiting for her channel to open. Outside her window, somewhere in the dark between systems, the humans were still moving, patient and quiet and cold, the way things are when they have already decided and all that is left is the doing. Working their way through the list, one name at a time. The meeting was arranged on a station called Meridian Point. It was an old structure built in the early days of human space travel, when the first contacts with other species were still new enough to be exciting, before the compact had decided that excitement was something to be managed and contained. Meridian Point had been a trade station, then a diplomatic hub, then a kind of neutral gathering place for anyone who needed to talk to someone from the other side of an argument. It was not beautiful. It was large and functional and slightly worn down in the way of things that many different kinds of beings had passed through over the years. Arch Admiral Serene Voss arrived on a Selene diplomatic shuttle, alone except for 2 aides and a personal security officer she had told to stay outside the meeting room. She was not afraid of the meeting. She was not afraid of much, and what she was afraid of, she had learned a long time ago to set aside. She arrived exactly on time. General Admiral Tobias Wren arrived 2 minutes early, which Serene Voss noted and stored as information. He was a large man, broad in the way of people who had worked physical jobs in their youth and kept some of that build even as age changed other things. He had gray in his dark hair and a face that had settled into a kind of permanent steadiness, the way faces do when the person in them has spent a long time not letting the face do what it wanted to do. He stood when she entered. She noted that too. And while small things told you large things if you were paying attention. She sat, he sat, the aides sat at the edges of the room. There was a table between her and Wren, long and plain, with water on it that neither of them touched for a long time. She had prepared opening remarks, diplomatic positioning, the kind of language that established parameters before the real conversation started. She had written it carefully. She looked at him for a moment and she put it aside. "I'm going to skip the preliminary part," she said. "I've been in enough of these rooms to know when it's useful and when it's not. I don't think it's useful today." He said, "I agree." She said, "Is there anything we can give you that stops this before there are no breath left?" It was the question she had been building toward for weeks. The question underneath every analysis she had written. She asked it plainly because plain was the right tool here. He was quiet for a moment. She watched his face, which did very little. She thought about everything she had written about humans and moral frames and the difference between strategic patience and this other thing, and she watched his face. He was thinking about something. She could not tell what. He was thinking about 41 names. He thought about them every morning. He had started doing it after Yaren 4 when he first received Colonel Vance's report. He had read the names and decided to memorize them because there should be someone in command who knew all of them, and because it felt like the right kind of discipline, not dramatic, not a ritual, just a habit of the mind. A small insistence that they were people and not numbers. Private Dara Ohen, her brother Kenji, Medic First Class Yusuf Ibarra, Corpsman Lena Marchetti, 23 medics total and 18 wounded soldiers who had been lying in the field under the ceasefire flag. He knew their ranks, their colony of origin, their years of service. He had read their files. He had read some of their letters home, with permission from their families, because he had wanted to know who they were and not just what they were. He thought about Dara Ohen, 19 years old, who had lain in a crater for 6 hours waiting to be found, who had been found by her brother, who had died anyway because the flag that was supposed to mean something had not been made to mean anything by the people holding the other side of it. He looked at Serene Voss across the table, and he said to her, "The Vreth High Command, the officers in the chain of command from Vral down. Everyone who gave the order, passed it along, or carried it out at Yaren 4. All of them. We want them handed over." Serene Voss said, "To be tried?" "To be tried," he said, "under human law, by human judges, using the Geneva Convention as the legal foundation." "The Geneva Convention," she said. He watched her say it. She knew what it was. He had expected that. "That is a 400-year-old human document." "Yes," he said. "You are asking us to accept human law as the applicable jurisdiction for crimes against human wounded under a ceasefire flag on a human contested moon?" "Yes. Human law, human court, human judges." She was quiet. She was thinking it through. He gave her time. Because this was a serious question, and she was a serious person, and she had asked him a straight question and deserved him asking a straight one back. She said, "And the war?" "The war ends," he said. "When the trial is done, the war ends. We go back to the table. We negotiate something new, something real." "The Keth and Dowhari are already out," she said. "I know. That leaves Solen and Vreth." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "The Vreth High Command will refuse. You understand that. They will not agree to be handed over to a human court." "That is a Vreth decision," he said, "and a Solen one. What happens after that depends on those decisions." She heard what he wasn't saying. She was good at that. She had been good at it for a long time. She said, "And if we refuse?" "The compact. If we say no?" He looked at her for a moment. His face was still. "Then we finish the list," he said. 3 words. Quiet and plain and as final as anything she had ever heard in a room like this. Not a threat delivered with force or anger or performance. Just a fact stated by someone who had already decided it was true. She had studied war for her entire adult life. She had been in rooms where threats were made, and she knew the difference between the performance of a threat, which was common, and the thing itself. The thing itself was rarer. She had heard it a handful of times. It did not sound like what most people thought it sounded like. It did not sound big. It sounded like this. She said, "I believe you." He said, "I know." They looked at each other. She said, "Hawana, give me time." "We're not stopping while you take it," he said. "The operation continues. You understand that." "I understand that." "How much time?" She thought about the Vreth High Command. She thought about their politics, their internal structure, the way decisions move through their leadership. She thought about the casualty projections she had seen, the fleet strength numbers, the rate at which Vreth military capacity was declining under the human operation. She ran the mathematics in her head the way she always did, quickly and without much fanfare. She said, 3 weeks. He nodded once. She stood. He stood. She extended her hand across the table, which was a human gesture she had learned years ago. He shook it. She left. Her aides followed. In the corridor outside, one of them said quietly, "Admiral, what did you agree to?" She said, "Nothing yet." She paused. "But we will." The Vreth High Command session lasted 9 days. Serene Voss was not in the room. No Solen was, because the Vreth handled their internal matters internally. She received reports from her intelligence contacts, summaries and fragments, enough to follow the shape of the argument without the detail of it. The argument was not, she gathered, about whether Yeren 4 had been wrong. The Vreth did not have exactly a framework where it was wrong. It had been practical, efficient. Vrel had made a calculation and acted on it. This was what commanders did. The Vreth understanding of war was built on the idea of total commitment. You removed threats when you could. The wounded were a future threat. The math was clean. When the argument was about whether any of that mattered now, it was a younger admiral, Serene Voss's contact told her, who finally put it in terms the session could work with. The admiral was named Shar Voss, no relation, and she had served in the Yeren engagement for 4 years and knew the human military well enough to have developed a particular kind of respect for it. She said, allegedly, standing in the middle of a session that had been going in circles for days, "We are not debating honor. We are not debating law. We are not debating whether what happened at Yeren 4 was correct under our own doctrine. I am telling you that the question in front of this command is a single question. Can we absorb what is coming without giving them what they have asked for? That is the question. Can we survive it?" There was a pause in the session. Someone asked for the casualty projections. The projections were put up. The session was quiet for a while. They handed over 43 people. The transfer happened at Meridian Point, 12 days after the meeting between Serene Voss and Wren. 3 days ahead of the deadline, which Serene Voss had pushed for because she wanted the humans to see that this was not a reluctant compliance carried out at the last possible moment. She wanted them to see it as a decision. The 43 included Varel, who was not, of course, there to be transferred. His name was on the list as evidence rather than as a defendant. The others were members of the chain of command, from the officers who had planned the operation to the soldiers who had carried the orders out. 42 living people and one name on a formal indictment. Wren received the transfer. Serene Voss stood beside him during the processing, which she had requested to do and which he had agreed to without discussion. She stood there because she wanted the people being transferred to see a Solan admiral standing with the humans. She wanted that image in the record. When the processing was done and the last of the 42 had been taken to holding, Wren looked at her and said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me. Write something that means this doesn't happen again." He said, "That's the second conversation." She said, "Then let's have it." The second conversation happened in the same room, the same table, but over several days rather than one. They were joined by the Keth ambassador and the Dahari representative, both of whom had requested inclusion. To the Vreth sent an observer, a junior diplomat who had no authority to agree to anything, which everyone understood was the Vreth's way of being present without being committed. They talked about the Geneva Convention. Wren had brought a physical copy, actual paper, old, the kind of document that had been reprinted so many times from its original that this version was a copy of a copy of a copy, but printed carefully and treated with something like respect. He put it on the table. Serene Voss read it. The Keth ambassador, Oreen Sal, read it slowly, stopping often, and she said at one point, "We have something like this. Ours is longer. Yours is simpler." He said, "Simple was the point." She said, "Yes, I see that." The Dahari representative, a pragmatic being named Harriet II, read it quickly and said, "1. This is about protection of non-combatants." Wren said, "Yes." Harriet II said, "We can agree to this in principle." Wren said, "I need more than principle." Harriet II said, "I know. That is what the next few days are for." Serene Voss said on the second day, "There is a question about enforcement. What is the mechanism if a party violates this?" The room was quiet. She said, "Because the mechanism we relied on before was goodwill, and as we have seen, goodwill is not sufficient." It was Oreen Sal who answered. She said, "The mechanism is this room. Any civilization that signs agrees to hold every other signatory accountable. Violation is answered not by one party, but by all parties who have signed." Wren said, "That's Article 1 as I understand it." Oreen Sal said, "Yes, Article 1. The wounded are beyond the reach of war. Not any civilization that cannot honor this will be answered by any civilization that can." She looked around the table. "This is what we did not have before. A joint guarantee. The humans had the rule. The compact had the rule. Nobody had the guarantee." The Vreth observer said nothing. On the fourth day, Wren said, "There is one more thing." He said it during a pause in the larger discussion, quietly without building to it. Serene Voss looked at him. 41 name, he said. "I want them in the treaty as the reason for it, not as a historical footnote, as the stated reason. The document should say who it was written for." The room was quiet. Oreen Sal said, "Agreed." Harriet II said, "Agreed." Serene Voss looked at the table for a moment. She thought about the field at Yaren 4 that she had never been to and had only seen through footage. The rust-colored ground, the ceasefire flag that had kept flying. She said, "Agreed." The Vreth observer left on the fourth day and sent back a formal note on the fifth that the Vreth Republic was not in a position to commit to the negotiations at this time. The note was polite and said nothing about the future. Wren read the note in his quarters on the station. He sat with it for a while. He thought about what the operation was currently doing, which he tracked every morning the way other commanders tracked casualty counts. The list, the progress through it, the work still left. He thought about whether the Vreth would come back. He thought they would, not because he wanted to believe it, but because he had read their history. One the same way a good commander read every piece of information available about an adversary. And he knew that the Vreth were a species that made calculations. They had made a bad calculation at Yaren 4. They had made a worse one in the weeks after, failing to understand what the humans would do. They were running the numbers now seriously, with the kind of focus that catastrophe produces in a species that prefers to live. He thought they would come back and sign. He thought it would take 6 more months of the operation before they came back. He was off by 3 weeks. They came back in 7 months with a new high command. The old one was standing trial in the court that had been established in the 6 months since the transfer, and a delegate who had actual authority in a very short statement that said essentially, Howdy, we are ready to sign. We understand what we are signing. He was in the signing room when they signed. He stood at the back and he watched each delegation affix their seal to the document. He watched all of it. He thought about 41 names. He thought about a girl in a crater, 19 years old, waiting to be found. He thought about the brother who had found her. He thought about a medic who had made a colonel laugh by treating her cracked rib, and how the pain of laughing had been worth it. He thought about all of them, one at a time, by name, the way he did every morning. He did not let his face do what it wanted to do. He was a commander. There were people watching him. He kept it still, and he watched the seals go down on the oldest and newest thing in the room. So the thing written in human blood 400 years ago on a planet that had not yet looked up at the stars, by human beings who had just finished doing terrible things to each other and had decided in the aftermath to write down a line and call it a limit. The signatures went down. The line held. The trial lasted 14 months. It was held on Earth, in a city called The Hague, that had a long habit of being the place where humanity brought its hardest questions and tried to answer them in front of witnesses. The city was old and quiet and had a way of making everything that happened inside its legal buildings feel permanent, like the stones themselves were paying attention and keeping records. The 42 defendants were held in secure facilities that were, by any honest standard, seemed more comfortable than what most of their accusers had experienced in the field. They had rooms rather than cells. They had access to legal representation, to food that met their nutritional requirements, to outside air and enclosed yards at scheduled times. There had been a debate about this in the early days of the trial preparation. Some people had said that the accused deserved something harder, something less comfortable. Advocate Mira Ose, who was the lead prosecutor and had been selected for the job after a long process that had involved many arguments in many rooms, had said simply, "The whole point is that we treat the surrendered with decency. The point is that we are not them." The debate ended. The proceedings were broadcast, every session in full, transmitted to every relay station in the known human network, and from there, went through the various signals agreements that had been worked out in the months since the treaty, to every inhabited system in the compact's territory. The Keth picked it up and retransmitted it on their own networks. The Dahari did the same. Even in Vreth space, where the official position on the trial remained complicated for most of its duration, the broadcasts were accessible to anyone who knew which frequency to find. The galaxy watched, not all of it, not every individual, but enough. The way enough people watched a thing to make it a fact in the world. Something that could no longer be pretended away, something that entered the shared record and stayed there. Advocate Mira Ose was 38 years old, and she had spent her legal career prosecuting war crimes in human-on-human conflicts, which was less common than it used to be, but had not yet entirely stopped. She was from a city on the west coast of South America, and she had grown up in a household where her mother was a judge and her father taught legal history, and she had absorbed law the way children absorb things when it is simply the air of the house. Not as a subject, but as a way of seeing. She had prepared for the trial for 8 months before the first session opened. She had read everything. The Yaren 4 footage, all of it, every angle, every report, every piece of human history relevant to the charges. She had read the Geneva Convention so many times she could recite any article from any page. She had also read the Vreth legal tradition, the Compact's various frameworks for military conduct, when in every piece of expert testimony she had been able to collect about how each of the 4 Compact species thought about war. She walked into the courtroom on the first day, and she felt the weight of it, which was appropriate, because it was a heavy thing and the weight was the right response. The defendants sat in an area to the left of the main floor. 42 beings, most of them Vreth, one Solen, junior officer who had been part of the communications chain that confirmed the order. They had legal representation, as was their right. Their legal representatives had argued in the pretrial phase about jurisdiction, about applicable law, about whether a human document could serve as the legal basis for actions taken by non-human military officers under the command structure of an alien military. Yet Rosé had responded to all of it in writing, in briefs that the presiding judges had found sufficient to proceed. The key argument was simple. The victims were human. The ceasefire flag was a human system. The protections that had been violated were protections that the human side had offered in good faith under an agreement both sides had signed. The applicable law was the law that covered the victims. The court's jurisdiction flowed from that. The trial was not a drama. Real legal proceedings rarely were. They were meticulous and slow and full of detail, and the detail mattered precisely because it was not dramatic. The details were the point. This person gave this order at this time through this channel to this person who passed it to this person. This person fired this weapon. This person wrote this report and called it this. The record was built piece by piece, specific and small, until the whole of what had happened at Uran 4 was in the room in full, as completely as it could be reconstructed, with nowhere to hide. The defendants' representatives tried different approaches. They argued for their client's belief that the actions were militarily justified. They argued for the lack of precedent in Vreth military law. They argued about intent. Osei answered each approach carefully, taking her time, building her responses the way good arguments are built. Not with force, but with clarity. The kind of clarity that does not allow the fog of competing claims to settle. The question came from one of the defendants directly, in the third month of the trial, during a session that had been devoted to testimony about the chain of command. One of the lower-ranking officers, a young Vreth soldier who had been a weapons technician aboard one of the ships that carried out the Yaren 4 order, asked through his representative to speak. He was given time. He was respectful and quiet. He said he wanted to understand something. He said he had been thinking about it since before the trial, since the day on the ship when they had returned from the operation and filed their reports. He said he had tried to find the answer himself and had not been able to. He said, "I don't understand why this is different from any other death in the war. We have killed humans throughout this conflict, many humans, every day of 11 years. You have killed Vreth. That is what war is. Why does this particular killing require this particular response? Why does it matter more that they were wounded?" The room was quiet. The presiding judge looked at Osei. She had expected this question, not necessarily in this form, not necessarily from a defendant directly during testimony, but she had expected the question because it was the heart of everything. It was the question the trial was actually answering. She stood. She said, "Because the wounded cannot fight back, that is the first reason, and it is sufficient on its own. But I will continue. Because the medics treating them had made a choice, a legal choice, recognized by both sides of this conflict, to be healers, to step out of the war. When someone steps out of a war voluntarily to help the fallen, they are owed safety in return. This is not a human invention. Every species represented in this courtroom has a version of this understanding. The Vreth have it too. You call it something different. The word translates roughly as the set-aside. Those who are set aside from the fighting are set aside from the dying." She paused. The room was listening. The feeds to the relay stations were active. She said, "But I want to answer your question fully, because you asked it honestly. There is a deeper reason. The ceasefire flag was flying. That flag is a human system, and it means one specific thing. The war is paused. Everyone under that flag is no longer a combatant. They are just people. People who are wounded. People who are trying to help the wounded. People who have put down the war and asked only for the chance to survive or to help others survive. What happened at Yaren 4 was not a military decision made in the heat of combat. It was a decision made in cold calculation to kill people who were no longer part of the war. Your sub-executor called it field-efficient neutralization of future combatants. I want the record to note that phrase, because that phrase is the entire case. He did not see people on that field. He saw future problems. He saw math, and that is exactly the kind of seeing that the document in front of this court was written to prevent. Not because humans are more valuable than other beings, because no wounded person under a ceasefire flag is a combatant. Not human, not Vreth, not any species, not ever. That is the line. She sat down. She did not explain further. She did not add to it. The room held what she had said, and she let it. She had learned from the document she was prosecuting under that sometimes the right thing to do was to make your argument and then go silent and trust that the people in the room were intelligent enough to carry it the rest of the way. The verdicts came down on a Thursday. Guilty on all primary charges for 38 of the 42 defendants. The remaining 4 received lesser verdicts on reduced charges, which Osei had expected. The chain of command's lower end was always complicated, always involved people who had followed orders without full information, and the document had language for that distinction too. Sentencing followed. It was measured and specific, as sentencing should be. The most severe consequences went to those who had given and transmitted the orders. The technical personnel received less. Everything was in the record, publicly, in detail. The transcript ran to several thousand pages and was entered into the permanent human legal archive, which meant it would exist in accessible form for as long as humans maintained their record systems, which based on current projections was a very long time. The Vreth High Command that signed the treaty watched the verdicts in a room together, which was unusual for their process, but which someone had suggested and nobody had objected to. They watched the verdicts come down. They said nothing to each other for a while. Then they said what they needed to say, privately, and what they said in that room has never been fully reported. But the decisions that came out of the Vreth political process in the following months suggested that the conversation was a serious one. The Treaty of Yeren 4 was signed in the 6 months following the verdicts. 37 spacefaring civilizations. Not all of the galaxy was larger than that. And there were species in the outer arms and the deep voids that humans had not yet met and the compact had known only as signals and distant light. But 37 was a number that meant something. It included every species that had been part of the compact. It included several that had been neutral throughout the conflict. It included 2 that had been, technically, allied with neither side and had watched everything from a distance and then sent a delegation to the signing with a short message. We have read the document. We wish to sign. Article 1 was the one that mattered most, and they all signed it. The wounded are beyond the reach of war. Why any civilization that cannot honor this will be answered by any civilization that can. It was a human article written by human hands 400 years before any human had left their own solar system. It had started as a modest document written after a catastrophic war, one of many catastrophic wars in human history, an attempt by people who had just done terrible things to each other to draw a line and name it a limit. It was a galactic document now. Sarah Vance retired 3 months before the treaty signing. She had served for 22 years. The last 2 had been the hardest. Not because of the fighting had largely been done by others, by the people running Protocol Nemesis, the planners and the fleet commanders and the intelligence personnel. She had been in command. Safars had signed what needed to be signed and made what needed to be made. But the weight of it had been with her every day, the same weight it had been since the ridge at Yeren 4. She chose to retire in the months after the trial. She gave her papers to the appropriate offices, and she left with the rank she had earned and a small ceremony that she asked to keep simple, and she went home. Home was a city on the coast of East Africa, warm and full of sound, where she had grown up and where she still had a small house that she kept going back to between postings, a place that always smelled like the ocean and the particular food she had eaten as a child. She had been away from it more than she had been in it over the last 22 years. Coming back always required a period of adjustment, of getting used to the quiet and the warmth and the way time moved differently when you were not at war. She received an invitation 6 weeks into retirement from the Memorial Commission that was overseeing the reconstruction of the site at Yeren 4. The moon was no longer contested. The compact had formally ceded its claim as part of the peace process, and the human colonial government had designated the plain where the 41 had died as a protected site. They were building something there. Nothing grand, the commission had told her when they briefed her. Something appropriate. Stone, names, space to stand and think. They asked if she would come for the dedication. She went. The plain was still rust-colored. Some things don't change. The sky was still that brownish yellow, weak light, slightly sick. She stood on the ground she had looked down at from the ridge, and she felt the ground under her boots, solid and real, and she looked at what they had built. It was a long wall of dark stone, low, the kind of height a person could touch the top of without stretching. The 41 names were cut into it, deep cuts, clear and clean. No rank, no unit, no designation. Just the names, the full names, first and last, in the order they appeared on the field report. The document that had listed them in a column under the heading Hours. She stood in front of it for a long time. She had memorized them years ago. She recited them now, quietly in her head. Not because she had forgotten any of them. She would never forget any of them, just because they deserved to be said. Just because saying a name, even silently, even only to yourself, was a way of insisting that the name still meant something. She heard footsteps behind her. She did not turn immediately. She had learned a long time ago to let people approach at their own pace. "Colonel Vance?" She turned. A young Keth stood a few meters away, uncertain in the way of someone who has approached a stranger and is not sure of the welcome. She was young, very young, maybe 22, 23 by the Keth counting. She wore the badge of the Memorial Commission on her shoulder. Vance said, "Retired now. Just Vance." The young Keth came forward a little. "I'm sorry to disturb you. I am assigned to the commission as a junior cultural liaison. I worked with the architects on the translation of the names." She looked at the wall. "And it was important to us, to the Keth team, that they were right." Vance looked at the wall too. The names were right. She had checked them when she arrived. "Thank you," she said. "They're right." They stood in front of the wall together for a moment. Then the Keth said carefully, "Did you know it would end this way? When it started, when it was still happening, did you know?" Vance thought about it. An honest question deserved an honest answer. "No," she said. "Were you afraid it wouldn't?" "Every day." The Keth looked at the names. She was quiet for a moment, the way young people are when they are finding words for something they feel but have not yet said. "My people have a saying," she said. "It is old. It comes from our war, the one 800 years ago that nearly finished us. It translates roughly as, 'The line that cannot be crossed is the one someone died defending.'" Vance nodded. She looked at the names. The Keth said, "Do humans have something like that?" Vance was quiet for a moment. She thought about the document, the one that had been on the table at Meridian Point, the copy that Wren had brought, the one that was now in the legal archive, and the treaty and the galactic record. Written 400 years ago, simple and clear. She thought about what it was, really, at its core. Not the articles, not the legal framework, the thing underneath all of it. The reason it had been written and the reason it had lasted, and the reason 37 civilizations had put their seal to a version of it on a Thursday morning in a room built for exactly this purpose. She thought about why humans had written it in the first place, after a war that had killed tens of millions, after things that would be difficult to say plainly even now. They had crawled out of that, and they had sat down and they had written the rules, not because they were better than what they had done, not because they were sure they would keep to the rules, because the rules mattered anyway, because you wrote them down so the next time, the time after this failure, the people who came after you had something to hold. You wrote them down so the line existed. So when someone crossed it, there was a word for what they had done. She said, "Yes, we have something like that." She did not say what it was. She did not need to. The Keth stood beside her in the rust-colored plain under the yellow sky, and they looked at 41 names cut into dark stone. And the wind came across the field the way wind always comes across open ground, low and constant, and it carried nothing with it but itself. The line was in the stone, the names were in the line, and the line would be there long after everyone who had stood in front of it today had become names in their own records, in their own walls, in their own memorials. Long after all of them were gone, and the plane had changed into whatever it was going to change into. And new species had found their way to this border moon that had no real name and had never been beautiful and had become, in the way of places where lines are drawn and held, something that the galaxy would keep coming back to. Not to celebrate, to remember. To stand in front of the names and say them, quietly, and know what they meant, and to carry the line forward one more day, one more generation, one more civilization at a time, into whatever came next.